Hello, hi, what's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and I am back at it again to give you guys my October reading wrap up. In the month of October, I read 14 books. I DNF'd 5 books, and I most recently published an author interview. I chatted with Paloma Ghosh, the author of Mouth, which was a short story collection I read earlier in the year, last month. And we had a really great conversation about reading, writing, and also the short story form, and I would love if you could check that out. And without further ado, let's just dive into it. One of the first books that I read was Long Live the Post-Horn by Vigdis Hjorth. This is my third book by Vigdis Hjorth. This is different than the other two in the sense that it is far less cyclical and repetitive. It is the story of a woman whose life is fine, but she's very like disaffected and unhappy. There's like this underlying tension, and she's kind of just like, what is the point of all of this? And she's working in this PR firm, and very early in the novel, we discover that one of her coworkers has committed suicide. Not just her coworker. This is she owns her own PR company with these two friends, and her co-founder owner guy committed suicide, and he sent her a note that was really mean, or like his note when he was resigning. And she's then gets tasked with the previous project he was working on, which was to save the postal system in Norway, and she's like, this is an impossible task. Her and the other co-founder who's left, they're grappling with it. They're really finding it really challenging, and then somehow she's able to get swept up into it, and she starts to find meaning in it, and she's like, this is important, we need to save this. Like, listening to these stories makes things different for me. Like, these individual stories do matter, and normally what we do in PR is we give it a spin that works for media, but that actually is like divorces the people from their story and from the words that they need to use, but let's try something different. And so she's starting to like gain this agency and gain this momentum. And a lot of what this book is actually looking at is language. There are moments where she's like, language is important to her because she works in PR, and PR does a lot with language, and like, how are you presenting something? What story are you giving it? How are you going to spin this and get better coverage, whatever it may be? And so a lot of her work does involve creating these briefs, or I don't know, sometimes they have some weird newspaper or magazine that they work on. They're writing a lot of content, and she's like, all of this is shit. And then she's doing this thing where she's trying to help save the postal system, and she's starting to like gain this agency. The book actually starts with her reading a journal entry from 10 years ago, and she's reading this journal, and she's like, everything that I was doing then was irrelevant. There's nothing that has really changed. I still go to the same places. Yeah, sure, maybe the names have changed of the people I'm involved with, but still, everything is so empty and meaningless. And it's a story of like her trying to get meaning and to really like choose life and to be an active participant in life. There is also, as this is a Vigdis Hjorth novel, this kind of conversation around family, but less obvious in this one. She has a strained relationship with her mother. She's really contemplating the familial unit. She is involved in a relationship with this guy, and that's a subplot going on in this book. And yeah, I would say that I was not as hooked with this one as I was with If Only and Is Mother Dead, but I do think it fits in with her other work in ways that make sense to me. The next book that I did was on audiobook, and this was called The Night Guest, which is, I believe, from Iceland. It is the story of a woman who, there's so much that is unexplained in this story, but allow me to give you a little bit of context before we get there. When we're introduced to our protagonist, she is waking up every single day in the morning. We all do, right? So she wakes up and she's just like still so tired. She's absolutely exhausted. She feels like she cannot get enough sleep in the whole entire world, and sometimes she has these like weird bruises. So she goes to the doctors, and no one's paying attention to her because primarily she was having these male doctors, and they were like, lady, you're crazy. And then she does find this really kind doctor who's more receptive to her concerns and listens to her and conducts all these tests, yada, yada, yada. What we come to find out is that her sister had died in mysterious circumstances, and there's this horror element in this book where our narrator is kind of a vampire, and I do think it's a fun twist on stuff, and I don't want to give away everything because I think the book is so short, and if I give more away, it's kind of like, why would you even bother reading it? But I did finish the book feeling like we needed more. And I think that I was kind of, I finished the book feeling as if I needed more. And I think we could have added more suspense and tension. And it kind of felt as if we needed one more draft before we really got to the story that we all should have got. Okay, the next book that I read was a nonfiction book on audiobook, and it was The Last Love Song, a biography of Joan Didion. This book is massive. I think it's about 600 pages. If you do it on audio, it's about 30 hours. And where does one even begin on discussing a book like this? This biography came out while Joan Didion was still around. I think this book came out maybe 2015, 2017, who really knows? But our author is looking at Joan Didion, birth till My Year of Magical Thinking and whatever, and the play that came from that. And we're getting a really strong understanding of her childhood. And I did think that was really interesting for me to see the ways in which she is a child of pioneers and frontiersmen, and the West is so embedded in her culture, and how she's so rooted to the place, and how she would spend time in her family cemetery, and she was driving along with her friends, and what kind of student was she, and then how she really wanted to go to Stanford. She placed all of these hopes and expectations on that, and that didn't happen. And then we also see what she was like in college, and how her professors wanted her to have a career in academia. They thought that was a possibility for her, but that was not something that was of interest to her. And even later, when she does go back to the university as an author to give a few speeches, her professors, the cohort around her, were like, oh, she's not for academia. And then they're also surprised when the conference room fills up with women who all want to hear Joan Didion speak, and who are interested in what she has to say about the culture and the vibes. And one of the things that this author also does is explore the ways in which Joan Didion was really concerned with narrative, and was grappling with how does one tell a story in the time, the place that we're at in history and culture, if it feels as if the story format, the novel format, is not well suited for something like linear, where language is such a lie, where there's all of these things happening that our government is lying to us. There's all of these seismic changes that are happening, and yet the novel, it was something she was really grappling with. And that's why what we see in her fiction is that, in her nonfiction, is that that's when she's able to really cultivate a narrative and give a story more structure. And it's something that seems like this was such a big tension for her, and maybe might explain why for so many people her nonfiction is stronger than her fiction. And then the other thing that I'd like to say about this is that we see the ways in which her relationship with John Donne, how they were quite almost codependent, and they had a really strong working relationship. We see what it was like for them to create in Hollywood, and the scripts they were working on, and some of the criticisms that she received when her novels were turned into films, and the ways in which she was able to create such strong, unique films. But yeah, that whole section of their time in Hollywood was really interesting, and the ways in which they felt like they had to continue with screenwriting, whatever, you know what I mean? How they had to continue with that, because by doing so that they would then get healthcare. But towards the end of their tenure as screenwriters, they created an LLC situation. It wasn't an LLC, maybe it was an S corp or whatever, but they had started a business because they wanted to spend less time being stuck in all those meetings. But in many ways, that's not how Hollywood worked. So that business venture wasn't that great. And we also see how early on, when she was working at Vogue, she actually was kind of considering the concept of start opening a mall. That was something that was really of interest to her, real estate. And her brother does end up going into real estate, and I think somehow maybe they had a business together or something like that. So we're also seeing the ways in which she was quite almost entrepreneurial and had a really strong business background. There also are these times when sometimes I felt as if the author would go off onto these tangents about things that were happening in the culture. For example, the Patricia Hearst kidnapping, which went on for days and days and days, in this book. we did not need all this information. He could have summarized it really short, quick, sweet, and that would have been great. And like things like that happened quite a bit. Especially, I learned so much about Joan Didion's brother-in-law, and yes, I know he was like an important person in the scene. I don't think he was really that important in her biography. So there's moments like that that would take me out of it. But I think seeing her as a young girl, as a college student, her early days at Vogue, and then also her career trajectory was really insightful. The final thing that I'm going to say about this is what we do learn from this book is that, when it is so fascinating to think, because we now know Joan Didion, like, as Joan Didion, the figure. And this book helps to see her throughout her whole entire career and the moves that she was making and how calculated she was at certain times. Like, she was a really active participant in the photos in the back of the book, and her front of the book, like she was really vocal about what she wanted and the image she was crafting. But also at the same time, what we see is that there were so many projects that she wanted to do but she wasn't able to do, and as a result of that, that's why we got the writing that we have of Joan Didion. For example, she really wanted to go to Vietnam. She wanted to be there. No one would send her to Vietnam. She was not able to do that. From reading this, I got the understanding and the impression that Joan Didion got a lot of no's, and as a result of that, we have the work that we have. And it made me wonder, like, had that not been the case, had she had people said yes to her for the things she wanted to do, what work would we have gotten? How would that have differed? Would we have seen a different Joan Didion? Would her career trajectory have gone differently? Obviously, it's, what do we really know, right? We only have one history that we've seen happen. And then what else did I want to say? Anyways, we'll move on to the next book. The next book that I read was Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers. This is a very short, slim pamphlet. I think the authors of the book, I think it originally came out in 1972, and then this was a reissue in the more recent years. And the authors started this book to really consider the ways in which women, historically, were providing medicine and acting as resources for everyday people, the peasants, whatever, and how the shift in England and in the US made it such that women were kind of removed from the medical system, and what were the political and social structures that were put in place to make that possible. And you see these like power imbalances. It's really, really short, very brief, but gives you a quick understanding of how we've gotten to the healthcare system that we have. Not entirely, okay? Like, you're gonna run with that and you're gonna be like, this will explain everything and healthcare and whatever. No, it's not like that. It just shows the ways in which people in power made it such that women were not able to work and provide services to the poor and to the everyday person. So really interesting, but just a taster of like history, and you'll probably learn a few things that you might not have otherwise known. Okay, the next book that I read was Paradise Logic by Sophie Kemp. This is a book that comes out in March 2025. This is a book courtesy of NetGalley, and this is an interesting book. It is told, it has a unique voice, and this voice is carried throughout the whole entire novel, and it's quite fun. It's a story of Reality, who is 23 years old, living in Brooklyn, and her friend / like, they're a little bit more than friends, but not an emotional connection. He's just like, Reality, you need to get a boyfriend. Like, you just have too much free time on your hand. You need a hobby. Go get a boyfriend. And so Reality embarks on the quest to become the best, most perfect girlfriend in the whole entire world. And she gets involved with Ariel, who is a professor, so an adjunct professor, I don't know, not like an actual professor, but like a wannabe professor. I don't know how academia works, but whatever. He's this guy whose his area of expertise is the ancient Assyrian Empire, and he'll come back from teaching and has to grade papers, and he smokes crack. Like, not the ideal boyfriend, but she gets fixated on him and she embarks on this quest, and things get very surreal and trippy because there's this magical magazine that will pop up, and it gives the girls all the tips on how to be the best girlfriend and how to be a hostess and what you got to do and how you have to please your man. And then she starts like taking this medicine to make her an even better girlfriend, and then it kind of ends in this odyssey. Like this is a story of a girl going on a quest, and the novel is broken up by these chapters of like part 1 when our hero does blah blah blah. Really fun. It reminded me of slightly, okay, of Manic Pixie E-Girl, which was that TikTok book and it reminded me of something else. What was that second? Oh, it slightly reminded me The Princess of 72nd Street. Not slightly, it does remind me of The Princess of 72nd Street, which is I think a good comparison to make, because before I read this book, I read Sophie Kemp had done some interview or something like that where she had to pick 5 books that had influenced her craft, and she put The Princess of 72nd Street on there, and I think both of those are kind of working with the similar-ish like vibe. You have a protagonist who is quite who's female and who's almost looking for validation through men, but is experiencing a lot of violence and just trauma and like not pleasant things from the men around her, and they're trying to figure out their place in the world. And yeah, I'm curious to see what Sophie Kemp will do next, because it's an interesting debut. The next book that I read was more a memoir of open marriage. Now, okay, for a while, I don't remember what publication it was, but I know that before this book came out, the author wrote an article, and maybe it was for The Cut, because this is very much so The Cut fodder. And this article maybe it was New York Times, I don't know. This article was doing numbers, and in the article she was talking about how her and her husband started this open marriage. And this memoir is then the continuation of that. We get more information, and this is a fun book to read in the sense that this is such a messy, like, I think this book spans a decade of her life, and just so much mess. For that reason, I've really liked it. I love a messy book about someone's love life. And I do have to add that I was reading on Goodreads some of the reviews, and a lot of people, I've noticed this with memoirs, because I often then go and look at some of what's written on Goodreads, and many people will say things about memoirs where they're like, I wish the author was more self-aware, like, gosh, the privilege just reeks and blah, blah, blah. And I just think that we're going about memoirs all wrong if we're looking for people who are self-aware. I do not want a moral. I do not want to hear about how this person realized something. No, I want you to be so delusional. I want you to be batshit crazy so that I can read this book and be like, thank God, you know? That's not my path. I'm happy with who I am, and I love my life. That's what I really like. This book did that, and it also gives you it's a good conversation starter. But anyways, so the memoir starts off with her discussing how, like, when she first met her husband, I think his name was Ike, I don't know. She's like, before we got married, my husband had so many more partners than I had, and he's kind of said something like, oh, don't worry, at the end it will all even out, as in she could have more later, something like that. And in the beginning of the novel, she meets this one guy, Michael, I don't know, they're flirting, and her husband encourages her to, you know, have fun, do it up. And so that's the beginning of their open marriage, and you see the ways in which they start to, like, put in these rules and how they're figuring it out, blah, blah, blah. And she then finds out, like, as the memoir progresses, that her mother was also involved had an open marriage with her father. And so she's, like, learning more about that. Her mother also has an illness, and the other thing that's going on here is that at the same time, while our protagonist is embarking on the journey of an open marriage, she's also trying to find herself, because what we discover is that she suffers quite badly from migraines, and she has wonderful therapists. Like, her therapist is the real star of the show. That man was so patient and gave really great insight to her, but he kind of points out that her migraines could be a result of her not listening to herself, that, like, she's always trying to acquiesce to everyone else and make sure that everything's good for them, and not listening to her own needs and not making herself happy. Anyways, when it comes to the open marriage, I really think that there was a Goodreads very short review that really hit the nail on the head, that said this woman should not be in an open marriage. And you know what? I do think that's true. I don't think she had the emotional fortitude to really weather the various storms. And I did also get the impression, and you could say like, okay, this is just one woman's experience. That isn't to say that everyone's experiences are like that. Sorry for the weird light. My screen protector's broken. But because as this progresses, her husband also starts to have more relations, and it benefits her husband way more than it benefits her. She has to experience so many just shitty men, and it's the kind of thing where you're like, why are you putting up with this? Like, I've literally read this and I was just like, you need hobbies, you need more hobbies. And she does start to get hobbies, but it's just like, how does one manage this? Like, the amount of like time and money that needs to be spent into it, because basically they do have a rule that neither one of them can bring partners back to their home. And so they're spending so much money, especially her husband, who every time he is dabbling in the sea of options available to him, he will take a woman out to dinner and then a nice hotel. That adds up. And they're living in New York City. They have 2 kids. It's just like kind of crazy. Like, just the logistics of it all. But I thought it was a really fun read for me because it has that like gossipy, salacious quality to it. But if you're not down for that, it might not be for you. Okay, the next book that I read, I want to get my reading notebook for because I had some lovely notes. Be right back. Okay, hello. I hope you didn't miss me too much. The next book that I read was The Stranger's House, Writing Northern Ireland, and this is a nonfiction book that's slim yet interesting. I was really liked this book so much. So the author is contemplating writers from Northern Ireland and looking at, I think this book could have been longer, looking at for some of the characters. It's I guess you could say it's a group biography, but not exactly. There's maybe about 10 authors that are mentioned, and the author of this book will look at maybe their childhood, what was it like to grow up where they grew up in Northern Ireland, but like the specifics of their class and religion and how that impacted them throughout the entirety of their life. And it introduced me to authors who I did not otherwise know, but also, and if you're more aware of the UK writer scene, you probably know some of this. It talks about how the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe author, what is his name? I don't know right now. He was born in Northern Ireland. Oscar Wilde was also born in Northern Ireland, and kind of just like reframing some of those characters, but also talking about others who I hadn't known. And then it moves throughout time, and we get to like a little bit more present day. We talk a little about Seamus Heaney. We talk about the author of The Milkman. What is her name? She won Booker, right? Let's see. Anna Burns wrote Milkman. And so yeah, we're seeing that there's this concept of home and homesickness and how that is prevalent themes throughout these authors' work, and the horror of childhood, also the ways in which the Irish landscape affected these authors' descriptions of place. And yeah, I thought it's an interesting way to consider these authors and to look at their work. And the author does make the case that it's kind of hard to be like, oh, Japanese literature means this, Irish literature also then means this, but it's kind of just connecting these various threads in their work and presenting an interesting picture that, to me, I was really in it. And I, as I said earlier, wish the book had been longer, because not all of the authors are given the same amount of attention. I feel like in the beginning we get a lot more details about those authors. And for example, as I mentioned, Anne Burns, like we barely get enough information on her, I thought. And yeah, that was interesting. Okay, the next book that I read was Akhenaten, Dweller in Truth, a novel of ancient Egypt. This author, as I pointed out before, was someone who Jackie O was reading his work in French and then was like, we need to translate him into English. Let's make it happen. And things happened. And now we have his work. His most prominent work, what he's the most known for, I believe, is the Cairo trilogy. But this was an interesting foray into his work, really great on the sentence level. This is looking at ancient Egypt, obviously. I guess he's written about like 3 more, maybe a few more books that also explore ancient Egypt and have really interested me. So in this one in particular, we're looking at Akhenaten, who changed his name to Akhenaten, which was an homage to the Sun King, because Akhenaten is the only king in the whole entire ancient Egypt who was like, fudge the old gods, we're gonna worship the sun, monotheism is the way, bitches. And he's married to Nefertiti and whatever. So this book starts off, it's one of those like stories within a stories kind of thing, where it reminds me a little bit of Seasons of the Migration to the North and A Dictator Calls, elements of that. And so in this one, we're first introduced to our narrator, some young kid who's just loves history and needs to get to the bottom of mystery. And his father is like, oh yeah, you see that place, because they're strolling down the Nile or something like that. You see that place over there? That's the old king's old town and it's going to dust. And he's like, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to know more. And so he's like, go off, son, go do your thing. And so he starts to interview all of the various people that were big around Akhenaten's court. You have like his former general, his sculptor guy, his childhood tutor, his sister-in-law, and then eventually we're moving towards Nefertiti in the final interview with her. And I think that my one complaint is that I feel like we could have cut out one of the narrators, because after a certain point you're like, oh, it's kind of the same story, you know, but we're getting it multiple times, i.e. that's why my reference to A Dictator Calls. But with each telling, we're finding out more details. And it's this subtle, like, drip feeding of information and quite magical in that regards. I think this is really a book that's contemplating truth and the ways in which people close to power will manipulate the situation to get the best out of it, and to see the ways in which they will lie to themselves. And we finished the book probably with no clearer of a picture of who Akhenaten was and what kind of man he was. Well, actually we do know slightly, because there is this like reveal at the end and it's quite interesting. But yeah, I did enjoy this. My final thing that I want to say is that, like, if you're looking for historical accuracy, that is not true. What happens in this book is that Akhenaten dies and Nefertiti is basically isolated and has no power and is left to die in the former capital that Akhenaten had made. But in actuality, after he died, Nefertiti did bring the country back to a state of equilibrium, which is what I learned in When Women Ruled the World. So don't expect like proper historical accuracy. Like that wasn't the point of this book. This book is really to question truth and love and power and religion and belief. And I think the author did a really great job of that. Okay, the next book that I read was a book that was sent to me by the publisher. 831 Stories sent me this. It is a new publishing company that is trying to switch up the romance game, whatever. Publishes great covers. This is their first book that they published. It's called Big Fan. This is really well plotted in the sense that it moves at a quick pace. There is no like excess fat to be trimmed off of this book. This is a story of our protagonist, whose name I've forgotten. She works in like DC as a campaign strategist lady, but she's had just experienced a scandal because, lo and behold, her husband, who was part of this big political dynasty, was cheating on her with his intern, something like that. So she's just gone through a divorce, and she gets acquainted with a pop star who used to be her childhood crush, and it's this romance between the two. Okay, now I would have to say that this is really easy to read, like perfect plain reading. I'll put it on the side. Perfect plain reading. It's really more of a novella than an actual novel. I just think that I'm not politically, like, the space of DC does not interest me, or like I don't find it necessarily that interesting. And so, like, had the woman been another something else, like maybe she worked in fashion PR, I would have been like, oh, okay, cool. But as that was not the case, I wasn't able to really sink into the story as much and really run with it. I think though, if you like shows like Scandal or what is that, House of Cards, like if those are your kind of entertainment choices, you love Succession maybe, this is for you. If you're interested in the romance genre. After that, I read A Brief History of Vice, How Bad Behavior Built Civilization. And this one is exactly what it sounds like, a brief history of vice. And the author like does some crazy experiments. Like, my God, this guy really, he committed to the bit. But what he's doing is looking at various alcohol, coffee, things like that, giving us a historical background, really like going back in time. There's this chapter about weed and how the steppe people would use it as a tool in their rituals of grief. And the main point that this author is making, and I think it's really easy to read this and just be like, oh, it's a light, fun read, because that is the case. I'm gonna move because the sun. What the author's really, though, looking at is how in the past we had more of a culture around excess, vice, drugs. And when you have that, you're able to establish rituals in which to consume a particular vice, whatever it may be. But in our more modern day and time, we don't have that, and that's why it's easier for there to be excess and for there to be bad things that happen as a result of that. And so he's kind of just like, in the past when there used to be these rituals around these things, like that was good. It acted as a safety valve to culture and community, and it helped make things stronger. And yeah, that was my main takeaway from the book. Some anecdotes, little like factoids that we learned. One thing is the Stonehenge. You might know this, I did not know this, but is a really great acoustic system basically, and that if you play instruments with inside of it, the stones will vibrate and emit their own sort of hum. Another was that coffee was baptized in the ancient-ish world by Clement the Eighth, I believe, who literally was like, we need to baptize coffee because this shit is awesome. Okay, that's what I want to say about that book. Then the next thing that I read was Boudica, Warrior Woman of Roman Britain. Now, I was really struggling in the month of October with like what to read. That's why I ended up picking up Brief History of Vice. It was not something serious. Also, Boudica seemed like it wasn't going to be a serious book, and in many regards, it was not a serious book. But, I mean, it is a serious book, but not serious in the sense that it would like stress me out. This book does not give as much information about Boudica, and that's okay because the author does point out that this is not a history of Boudica. One, because we don't know that much about her, but secondly, the author's primary goal here was that this is a literary analysis of Boudica, looking at two Roman authors and the different writing that they did about Boudica and how that related to their concepts of Roman identity and what it meant to be a man versus a woman, and how their writings were actually a response to Nero and the ways in which he was a bad emperor, and they felt as if the women in his circle were really orchestrating power. And so that's what this book is about. I think if you're really well versed in ancient history, if this is of interest to you, this will definitely be for you. And that's all I'm going to say about that. The next thing that I read was a library book, South and West, Joan Didion, from a notebook. So, okay, I was obviously in the library and I picked this up because it was short, and I thought I would give Joan Didion's nonfiction another chance, sort of, I guess you could say. The thing is, I sometimes struggle with Joan Didion's fiction because I find it to be really impressionistic. She writes wonderful, fabulous, strong, clear sentences, but she also sometimes writes, and I'm like, what are you talking about, lady? Like, it's just vibes. And sometimes like the sentences will just wash over me and I have to like really focus. But I didn't feel that way when I was reading Run River. Run River, I was really immersed in it. And this is so slim, but there still were moments where I'm just like, anyways, this is looking at South and West. This book came out in 2017, and so there's a foreword where the author is like, Joan Didion, back in the 70s, like the observations she was making, this explains why Trump was elected. Who's to say, really, if that, I don't know if I necessarily buy that, but while reading this, we're looking at her just driving around, and she's in the South because she wanted to write a story. She does not end up writing that story, but she's trying to understand what it's like to be from the South, and looking at that to help her understand the West and California and whatever. And she's meeting these various men, people who are like, oh, you should meet so-and-so, whatever. But she's also just drifting. She'll go to the laundromat and look at the women there. She gets her nails done, and she's talking to these young women and seeing what opportunities are available to them. And I think at this, like, her writings when she's observing women are so strong. Like, there's just one or two sentences that she paints a picture so well, and it really it makes things stand out to me. And then the final section of this book is her notes on California, and she's revealing details about growing up. She's talking about how growing up she was raised as a romantic. She was wearing these like soft greens and a dusty pink, and that was different from everyone else, and she wished so badly that she could be like everyone else, but she knew that she wasn't. And she then ends these Californian notes by talking about I am at home in the West. The hills of the coastal ranges look right to me. The particular flat expanse of the Central Valley comforts my eye. The place names have the ring of real places to me. I can pronounce the names of the rivers and recognize the common trees and snakes. I am easy here in a way that I'm not easy in other places. I find that last sentence so fascinating because I had earlier in the month read The Last Love Song, a biography of Joan Didion, which we really hammer home the point of how uneasy Joan Didion was in so many places and settings, and the observations that other people make about her, and how they all point out that she seems like a very anxious, nervous person with a will of steel. And I think I will be writing more about this in my newsletter, so keep an eye out for that. Make sure you're subscribed. You can subscribe for free. The link is in the description. After this, I read another memoir. Wow, really on a memoir kick. I read The Chiffon Trenches by André and Talley. I read this because the Met Gala theme has been announced for 2025. It is something about like dandyism. And I watched a TikTok where they were like, André Talley was a really big proponent of that, and part of that was through his style, obviously, but his style ethos was strongly influenced by his upbringing and his church going. And then I decided to read this. It is interesting. The author, like André Talley, reads it himself, so in that regards, it's really good to do on audio. But I think this book came out 2 years before he died, and you can tell that this is his final word on his life. Like, he's settling scores, he's making sure that the people he wants to thank know what's up, know what's good, and you see the ways in which he is moving through life. Like, if you want to lobby a complaint, and this is something that also gets lobbied at certain memoirs, like it is name dropping, but you want him to name drop because he's hanging out with Tom Ford, YSL, Karl Lagerfeld, Diana Vreeland. Like, these are the people, you know, that you want to know more about, and like whatever. So it's okay that he's name dropping. Like, it would be weird if he didn't talk about his friendship with these people, Lee Radziwill and the De La Rentas and Tom Ford, you know, like he got his start by being an intern to Diana Vreeland at the Met, and then she helped him score a job at Interview magazine, so he was hanging out with Andy Warhol. Like, you know, he was seeing culture shift and these really big important moments in fashion, and yeah, I thought it was really interesting to see that. We also learned more about his upbringing and how close he was to his grandmother, the ways in which women were so instrumental in shaping him, and acting, these matriarchs really helped him in life, and when they die, how much that hurts him, and it's such a shock to experience that level of grief. And you see how he mentions, you know, the abuse and the sexual abuse he suffered as a child by, I believe, his like neighbors, and then that's obviously horrible. And he's then goes on to say, like, as things are happening in the 70s, 80s, and like the AIDS crisis is about to start, he's kind of just like, you know, it is because of the abuse I suffered as a child that I did not engage in sex and relations with other people in that level, because I was so traumatized by that. But that also saved my life because I was able to not, you know, die early. And you see also how he places such an emphasis on how his education and what it is that he brought to the table, his taste level, his understanding of history. He was a really big like Francophile and was so fascinated by the history of the French aristocracy, and that's something that he's able to then have in common with Karl Lagerfeld. They were friends for 40 years, and he talks about that. And you also see the ways in which he gives the observations of people. He talks about how Karl Lagerfeld was someone who was not able to look death in the eye. He hated to talk about death. He would clam up. He was not interested at all. His mother died and he returned to the party. He did not ever speak about her ever again. And you then see they're falling out, and you see the ways in which, like, what role André Leon Talley played to Anna Wintour and how he was able to give her, you know, the fashion like point of view. And he also speaks about the ways in which Anna Wintour is a woman in power in fashion, and what is good about her and what is also bad about her. In the sense that he's like, she is really great at making decisions. She is someone who will say yes, say no, but also when she's unhappy, she doesn't like your work, she doesn't tell you why. She just cuts it out of the magazine. And then you think about that, you're like, well, if you're a young person trying to grow in the industry, or even if you're not a young person, if you're just trying to get better at your job, how are you able to get better at your job if you don't get feedback? But that's not what Anna Wintour does. She does not give you feedback. She is just very decisive, yes or no. And he talks about their friendship, but also like how they were kind of at a like distance from each other. He talks about regrets and how he wishes that he had more friends that weren't just in fashion. Like, he really prioritized work so much, but he was able to do some really great things. He started to curate exhibitions for the Savannah College of Arts and Design, I believe, and how he wished that he could have done that for the Met, but Anna Wintour did not give him like a place to do that. Yeah, very interesting. I think that's all I want to say about that. Oh, actually, the final thing that I would want to say is that we see that also how André Leon Talley conceptualizes his style and how he thinks about as he begins to put on weight because he was like so upset by the loss of his grandmother, and like as he starts to weather the sadness that is life and losing these important people to you, he turns to food as a sense of comfort, and naturally his weight like expands and he's unable to come to grips with that. And he's like writes that this will be a challenge for the rest of his life, but then he also talks about how because of that he then starts to, you know, change his style and what are the reference points that he looks at to do so. And I think that's like really interesting when he talks about how he was looking at, you know, aristocracy of non-Western countries and thinking of that and conceptualizing his wardrobe. I thought that was really lovely. Then the last book that I read was Art and Nature by Tove Jansson. These are, I believe, 14 short stories, and naturally they're all connected to art. That's what unites them. And these were like all fairly short stories, but there were a few times where I was like, oh, I wish that was just a little bit longer. But what's really great about this collection is that they're looking at these like everyday moments almost, but also so many of the characters were older and they were looking at their relationship to art. The first short story is of a security guard who's working at an exhibition, and he comes across two people who have stayed past the museum's closing time, and he's talking to them, and he has a light bulb moment about art that is so lovely. And he explains it to the two people and they just don't get it, but that revelation that he has is so great. And that's kind of what this collection is about. It's looking at art in relation to individuals, but most of the individuals are older, and so there's this like questioning of aging, of thinking about youth, but also about the elderly. So two of the stories that really did that quite well was there's this one story about these three women who go out to eat, and they're like having a fun evening out on the town, but they're also like seeing young people, and all three of them is having a different experience to that. And one of them is an author, and she's like I write about young people, but I don't know young people. That one was really strong. And then the second one is this woman whose companion is her grandson, and he's taking care of her, and he's quite frustrated with her because he's like, she has no concept of time. When it's daytime, she thinks it's night. When it's nighttime, she thinks it's day. And then as the short story like changes, we see that it's actually the grandmother who's worried about her son because she's her grandson, because she's like, he takes time too seriously, and that is the folly of youth. And so that's like, I don't know, I thought it was kind of delightful. And it was an interesting way to frame a short story collection. Okay, wow, so much talking. Those were the 14. Oh no, I actually wanted to talk about the books I DNF'd, because that's not something I normally do, but I did DNF 5 books, and I just want to call them out because maybe they might interest you. Oh, I left the post-it upstairs. Oh, or is it here? Okay, I was wrong. So earlier in the video, I said I had DNF'd 5 books. That is a lie. I DNF'd 6. I'm a little bit annoyed because, I don't know, in the amount of time I invested into reading these 6 books, I probably, or trying to read these 6 books, I could have finished 2. But whatever, it's okay. I'm mentioning these books because, though I don't think I really got on with them, I think a few of them were because wasn't the right time or place. I want to share them with you just in case they might interest you. A lot of them are nonfiction, and we are now in November. That is Nonfiction November. Maybe you will want to check them out from library books or whatever. You know where to get books. Okay, the first book that I DNF'd, and I might return to this, I don't know. This book was sent to me by the publisher last year, and I was not able to get to it until now. This is Bluebeard's Castle by Anna Biller. Anna Biller is also a director. She directed The Love Witch, which visually looks like a really great film. I have not gotten the chance to watch it just yet. This is naturally a retelling of the fairy tale Bluebeard, whatever that's called. It's kind of campy, but also really just hits you over the head with its theme and over explains things. I was reading that I guess this was originally a screenplay, then turned into a novel, and you kind of get that. There's a lot of, she was wearing a Prada hat and a Versace dress and blah, blah, blah. And I just don't think those are needed. And there's lots of like references to how, oh, he was her husband was a mix of the protagonist from this book and this book and this book. And it's just, it starts to like over explain things, and this book is looking at the ways in which a woman could fall into a abusive relationship, but it really just, there's no subtlety, and that's what started to grate me, is that there's no subtlety, and it's just not the strongest of writing, in my opinion. Maybe I think that like Angela Carter's Bluebeard retelling might be what you should possibly pick up. But okay, the other book that I started but did not finish, A Travel Guide to the Middle Ages. This one sounds really interesting, but the first like hour of it was a discussion of maps, which I wasn't really vibing with. But it was kind of like one of the anecdotes that I remember was how the ancient worlds believed that, like ancient Western world believed that the earth, all the countries were like around a big lake. And the thing was like they hadn't figured out how to get all the way to the bottom of it. So that was fun. The next one that I started but did not finish was Fashionopolis. This is a book that came out, I believe, in like 2017. That's looking at fashion and sustainability. But I think I like nonfiction that follows like a through line, or like is taking us through one spot in history to another. And this felt a little bit too like case study-esque, and I wasn't vibing with it. The next thing that I started but did not finish was The Sprawl. This is looking at the suburbs and how the space of the suburbs, sprawling, boredom, whatever, can inspire art. I started this on audiobook and I didn't really love the narrator's voice, so that's why I put this down. The next book that I started was Who's Raising the Kids, which is an interesting book for me to read as I don't have children. But the author is like a child advocate and psychologist, something like that. And she's basically talking about the ways in which advertising is detrimental to young children, and how like it starts off with her talking about like, and I'm fully on board. I think I just stopped reading it because I was like, I think I get the point. But maybe there would have been more had I kept on going that like could have really kept me hooked a little bit longer, but she starts by saying that like really young children, infants, should not be given toys that, you know, make sounds and noises. Like they should be discovering like naturally like things that are already in the environment and being present in their body and making these observations for themselves. And then she also goes on to say that like also maybe young children shouldn't have so many branded toys, i.e. like an Elmo or Peppa the Pig, whatever, because she says it stifles their creativity in the sense that she's like, you know, you could give them a toy and be like, okay, tell me about this. Like, is this a mule? Is this a horse? Is this a donkey? Like, what is it? And the child will run with it and make a whole entire story. But then if you were to give them a toy from something that has a canon, an established canon that they've watched, that they would then be like, oh, like Elmo will always be Elmo. Elmo will not suddenly become Harry or something, whatever it may be. And so she's like, that really does stifle their creativity and that's not good. And I was really on board with whatever she was saying. I just was like, you could tell she was so passionate because the author herself read the book and it's quite earnest in that regards. And I just wanted to read something else. So I stopped listening to that one. And then the final book that I DNF'd was something that I was looking forward to, but I just don't think I was really like in the headspace for it. It was Triumph of the Yuppies, which is an exploration of America in the 80s and looking at yuppie culture. And I think I was maybe 2 chapters in and I was kind of just like, I'm not connecting the dots. I just feel like these are random people. I don't get what's happening. So that's that. Okay, thank you all so much for watching. If you've made it this far, you are a rock star. You are the best. You are awesome. I love to see it. I would love if you could let me know in the comments what's a great book that you read in the month of October. What are you looking forward to in November? What's happening? What's the vibes? Thank you so much. I'll see you later. Bye.